My name is Willis Walling. I came from New Jersey and I now live at the lakes at Pawleys Island. And we moved down here in 1982, actually full-time in 1990. We were part-time in 1982. And my wife said, well, if we can fly back for business, why don't we just go down there and live and fly down there and stay and go back for business. And that's how we come to be a full-time Southerner. Although I've been told that no matter what you do, you'd never get to be a Southerner if you came from the North. Well, I was living in Nutley, New Jersey, and four of our friends, my friends, buddies, we had met at a Sunoco gas station, and it happened to be the day of Pearl Harbor, and we heard it on a radio in the background. And we got talking about it, and first thing you know, Walt says, well, I think I'm going to try to get in the Air Force or the Navy. And somebody else said, well, gee, I think I'll get in the Marines. And it got around to my turn, and I don't know how it popped out, but suddenly I said, well, I'm going to be a fighter pilot. And I didn't know that I really cared about that until that particular moment. I did discover, though, that I couldn't be a fighter pilot because I didn't have any college training or education, and you were required to have 2 years of college to be a cadet. So I had to study for 6 months with the help of a local post office engineer, stationary engineer, Mr. Butterworth, who was good enough to coach me on engineering and some facts. Took the test, and I was very proud that I passed it as the second lowest in the state of New Jersey. And the major that told me I had passed made it very clear that my chances of graduating were very slim. Fortunately for me, I had a girlfriend, Peggy Steger, who I eventually married, but she was such a supporter and kept sending notes to me about every fourth day on postcards and in letters, and just said, don't worry about anything, just keep going, you're going to make it, and encouraged me and encouraged me. And I finally got into the class of flying, advanced flying school, and became a fighter pilot. Eventually was transferred from training planes to P-47s and joined the 361st Fighter Group as a replacement in case they lost somebody in their training for operational training. Fortunately for them, they had no damages of deaths during the training period, and it was a break for me because now I was experienced and put into a new outfit called the 371st, and it put me kind of one of the trainers instead of one of the students. And we found that we were at Camp Springs, Maryland, which is right outside of Washington, and our outfit was considered the protectors of Washington. And everything was fine, so I had been going with Peggy for 4 years, and at that point I thought we ought to get married. And I could understand her mother and father not being too happy about that because they were afraid I'd go overseas and maybe she'd be left with a child and it would be a burden on her and not fair in the way of normal life. But when we found out they were going to be protectors of Washington, we figured we were going to be there for the rest of the war, so we might as well get married. So we did get married on the 14th of November in 1943. And 2.5 months later, the government, in typical of its way, decided that they didn't need protectors of Washington any longer. So I found out that we had options. We could either go teach at the U.S. bases of new pilots, new trainees, or we could get together and form a new outfit called the 371st and go over together as a unit, fighting unit. So I went home that night to our little house that we were living in, and I said to Peggy, gee, hon, I've got some news that I don't know if you're going to like it or not, but this is the condition that we have. It's either go teach students or get together. And the tears started rolling down her face, and she said, I know you don't want to teach. And I remember my words. I said, well, I think I'd be safer flying against Focke-Wulf 190s than with a stupid student like I was in the back seat. And 3 months later, a month and a half later really, we ended up going overseas as a unit, and we were transported over on the British liner, the Mauritania. We got as far as Greenland, and while we were all being kept pretty quiet, there were 4,000 American pilots and their crews on that ship. We got a dirigible out there with a blinker, and we turned south and went all the way down to the Canary Islands. And apparently there was a wolf pack of submarines, German submarines, waiting for us. Had gotten word that we were coming, and they didn't want pilots in England, of course. So we got down to the Canary Islands, and we came in 2 days late into Liverpool, snuck in at night, and we were unloaded. We got down into a place called Bistern, where they were going to have a field for us, but there was no field. There were no tents, no living facilities. So we were living in the King's Forest, and we cut some of the King's trees to make fire. It was cold. It was early February, and we found out we had to pay for the King's trees that we cut. But the cooks that were there made coffee and kept us warm, and finally our planes arrived. But since we had no base, we had to go to Ipsley for our planes. And we shared a base with the British outfit that were flying Spitfires. So we got to be very friendly with a lot of the Brits, and we knew that they had really saved England for us to come over and be able to be in England, or there wouldn't have been in England. So that gave us a chance to get established, get our base fixed up, get the platforms down for landing, and get our P-47s down, get them ready to fly. And I think it was within 30 days we started flying escort missions, B-17s and sometimes 24s. We flew about 11 missions, if I remember correctly. And we did that with loss of only 2 pilots. We did get quite a few. I didn't get lucky, but some of the boys did get some 109s and a couple of Focke-Wulf 190s. It wasn't too long after that we had the D-Day take place. I had just had a very serious crash. My plane exploded for some reason or other. We never identified why. The explosion seemed to be in the cockpit, and when I came to from the explosion, I was on about a 30-degree angle going towards the earth, and Major Mack called me on the phone, and he apparently been hollering for quite a while and trying to tell me to get out of that airplane. I won't use his language, but when I heard it, it woke me up. And I looked down, and I was at about 600 feet over a whole bunch of British houses. And I said, Mac, I can't, there's too many Brits down there. And that's all I had time for, and I cut them off. And I tried to get the plane righted, and I looked up again, and there was a big house I was headed for. And I skidded to the right, missed it, went through a tree, bounced off the roof of a metal building, and into an airport, believe it or not, at Ipsley. And I woke up burning and managed to try to pull my legs up, and I couldn't use my legs. So I used both hands on the side of the cockpit, which was pretty hot, and pushed myself out. And I don't remember anything after that for about 3 days. They took me to the hospital. But there were 2 British boys on an anti-aircraft gun at the edge of that field, and they had pulled me away from the plane. Unfortunately, one of them ran in front of the burning plane, and the .50 calibers went off and caught the flesh of his backside a little bit. Didn't hit any bone, but it did tear some flesh off. But they saved my life. And I was in the hospital for about 10 or I guess it was 12 days. And at first they were going to send me home. And I begged the CO. I said, Colonel Klein, if you please think about it. I'm married. I don't want to go home and leave again if I get well. And he said, well, what makes you think you're going to get well? I said, well, that Swedish nurse you've got in there, she's had me sitting up, and she's getting me up so I can walk a little bit. And I think I'm going to make it. So he gave me another 2 weeks. And at the end of 2 weeks, with the help of my armor, my crew chief, they lifted me up and put me in the cockpit of the P-47, and I flew 1 hour, which qualified for military time, to go on a weather mission over Germany all by myself, which was a little ridiculous, but the CO was pretty accommodating. And I got back and I tried to make a landing. The first time I didn't make it, I was going to tip over. I got it back in the air. I did a circle of the base. I looked down and half of my outfit was down there rooting me home. And this time I was able to use my left leg more because my right leg wasn't working very well, and got it down without ground looping. And I got 10 more days to go off. And while I was on that 10-day leave, up in Edinburgh, D-Day happened. So I got on the train and went back to the base, and with the help of a sergeant who, I guess it was about the 12th of June, we started for France, and 16th we stayed there permanently in French soil at St. Mary-Glise. There was a sergeant came into my tent, and we were just in pup tents at the time, and he said, "Lieutenant, please don't ever tell anybody I was here, because they don't accept chiropractic in the military. That's against the rules." And he said, "But I think I can help your back so that you can get in a plane by yourself." And he had some hot packs and put them on my back, and he got me pretty mobile, so I was able to get back to flying. It wasn't long after that we were escorting Patton and chasing tanks down level, flying low, strafing trains, troops. It was a lot different than escorting, a lot more dangerous, frankly. And we were losing boys every day. There was one period there that we got 5 new replacements, and that night we lost 1 mission. 4 of them were gone. And that was just because they hadn't had experience. Some of them killed themselves by being too low with bombs and so forth. But that took us into that period of the passing into Paris. Patton got into Paris. And during that time at St. Mary-Glise, a gentleman came into our camp. He had his daughter in his arms, and she was obviously badly damaged. And there were no doctors anywhere because the Germans, when they pulled out, took the doctors with them. It turned out her name was Yvette Hamel, and one of the mortar shells that the Germans were firing at us landed about a mile away, and Yvette and her sister were milking cows, and it killed the sister, and the 2 cows fell down and crushed her legs and her shoulder. He had to amputate both her legs, and he put her shoulder in a cast, and we kept her for almost 6 months. We put a tent, I didn't, but some of the enlisted people put a tent up at the end of the runway, and they took some of the parachute silk that we found all over the place and lined it for her. And there was a doctor that, his name was Lezor, if I remember correctly. He took a liking to Yvette, and he saw to it that she got special foods that we weren't getting to help her get back on her feet. And she used to sit there in that tent, and we would all visit with her, of course, and she got to know us pretty well and say a few words in English and we in French. And she would check who left and who didn't come back, and then she'd say prayers with us for the ones that didn't make back. And her name was Yvette Hamel, as I mentioned. It turned out that we had to move with Patton, and they had to split our outfit up. Instead of being one group, we became squadrons at different places, supplying support, protection, trying to shoot up Panzer tanks that were chasing Patton and trying to keep him out, and helped him get into Paris. And Yvette was traveling with us as miscellaneous spare parts. We had commandeered a C-47 from the Transport Command and carried her as those parts. And we got to Saint-Dizier, which is up in the northwestern part, outside of Paris. And General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, or he was a general then, came to that base, having heard about her, and let her know that we had captured Paris, and that he could arrange for her to go to Paris Hospital to be fitted with wooden legs, or sent to the United States and get legs. Well, she was only 16, and it was a time of decision for her, and she hadn't seen her parents in over 6 months, didn't know whether they were alive or not, and she chose to go to Paris. And some of the boys did get to Paris to see her, but I didn't get relief to go at that time. Her father eventually got word through the Catholic churches, who had a bicycle arrangement from church to church, and he found out that she was in the hospital in Paris, and he bicycled all the way to Paris from St. Mary Glees. It took him 3 days, but he got to see her, and she did receive some wooden legs that we had all chipped in to pay for. The hospital had to be paid, of course. Later in life, we chipped in again, and she was fitted with better artificial legs so that she could move about. And just jumping ahead for Yvette, she eventually married, had a child, Martine, and had grandchildren. And back in the States now, the war is over, and I'm back in the States and raising a family and living in New Jersey again. And we're married. We had our first daughter, Susan. A year later, we had our second daughter, and 4 years later, we had our third daughter. And we decided that with 3 girls, we didn't want an all-girls baseball team, so we weren't going to get a boy, so we quit. And the Korean War broke out, and I got called back for the Korean War because I was on a mobilization assignment. As it turned out, they didn't call me back for flying. They called me back because I was one of the few fighter pilots that knew anything about personnel, having studied it while I was in the reserve. And they had called back 3,000 personnel to go to Mitchell Field for the First Army. And unfortunately, Washington, in its own decision, had decided who could be called back. And it was my job to get the ones that didn't have the right SSNs out and get their jobs back for them, and change those that could be changed so they could stay in. And that was my responsibility. And General Whitehead, who was the head of Mitchell Air Force Base, commented that he wanted me to stay in the service, and he'd see that I'd get another promotion. I was still only a captain at that point. And I said, that's not for me, sir, I'm sorry. I've got a family. I just promoted to vice president of our company as a sales manager, and I felt that that wasn't the way I wanted to go for military service. And he just about dressed me down that I was unpatriotic. And when he got all done, he said, "You still want to get out?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "All right, let's go to lunch." So we went to lunch, and I got back out and went back into working for the Swan Engineering Company at that time. It was promised to me that I would get some stock in the company. And one day I walked in after 7.5 years and found out the company had been sold, and I didn't get the stock. So I went to see the president and explained that I felt that this was not the way things should be done. So I was resigning, but I was giving him 30 days to find a replacement. That following Saturday, Mr. William B. Klee, who was the president of the company that purchased Swan Engineering, Damascus Tube, they made stainless steel tubing. We used a lot of it, and I guess we would be a good source for them. Called me on the telephone, and he said, "You gave 7.5 years to that company. If I fly out tomorrow, would you meet me at Newark Airport and have dinner with me?" So I said, "Sure, I'd be glad to." And he said, "Now, at dinner," he said, "you've really given 7.5 years. Will you give me 6 months?" And I said, "Well, why would I give you 6 months?" He said, "Because you're one of the reasons I bought that company." And I said, "Oh, you're pulling my leg." And he said, "No." He said, "You give me 6 months." He said, "Think about it. Talk to your wife." You gave 7.5 years. So I went home, talked to Peggy, and I said, well, what do you say? We give him 6 months. Yeah, I think it makes sense. Well, I became EVP of his company and got very much involved. And then they decided to sell the Swan Company. So I was against what they did. They had used all the money that they could get out of that company to build another one and decided they didn't need it anymore. And I decided that I'd like to buy it. And I had $11,000. I was buying a company that was a couple of $100,000. And I'm sure everybody thought that was a funny joke, but we went home. We had about $4,000 in an education account for our girls to go to college someday. And I think it might be an interesting story that we got together with these 3 girls who were 11, 10, and 7 and told them that we were thinking of buying this company. And what did they think if we were going to use some of their money to do that, to get a down payment? And Susan, the oldest one, said, do you mind if we go in the bedroom for a minute? We're going to talk about it. And I looked at Peggy and said, yeah. And I couldn't believe an 11-year-old would think like that, but they did. And they came back and said, we decided that you saved the money for us and you should use it. And to this day, that brings a tear to my eye, I'll tell you. So it ended up, we managed to work out an arrangement. I went to the banks, found out that that's not the place to go for money if you need money. Only go there if you've got money. But friends came by and offered to join me in the effort, and we formed another company, Swan Engineering, Swan Manufacturing. And we started with 8 people. We moved it in the middle of a storm, and my father, God bless him, he had been a manufacturer, manufacturing all his life, and he came out and he said, well, I'll help you get all the equipment loaded, because we weren't buying the building. I couldn't have afforded that. And I didn't like the building anyway, so we knew we had to move. Turned out in the middle of a snowstorm, we were moving the truck out, got on the street, main hill of Bloomfield, New Jersey, to go to Rockaway, and the truck turned and tilted on its back wheels. The police gave me 4 hours to get it out, or they'd call the riggers and have it moved at my expense. So we got some hydraulic jacks, and little by little we lifted the back end of that trailer up and got it set. And it was 3 hours and 20 minutes when we started back up the hill and got it out of there, and saved what might have been a $40,000 or $50,000 bill that I don't know how we would have ever managed. But we got it moved to Rockaway, New Jersey, and Peggy and I were now living in Whippany from Nutley, and it turned out to be a very convenient situation. Well, the missions were, as I mentioned, there was only 11 of those missions that we had. And at that point, between the British and the other outfits of the U.S. Taking on mission coverage or returns, we would actually get up very early and maybe escort the B-17s 2/3 of the way to the target, and then another group would come in who would save gasoline to take them to the balance of the target, or we would go meet them and bring them back out, whichever the case may be. And we would fly up to 35,000, 36,000 feet, try to stay above any interference from the Germans. They would try to get up a little higher than we if necessary. So we were battling that position of who could attack who if necessary. And we'd watch, and when they would start down, we would try to get on their tail and fly down, get them off. We were pretty successful in keeping them away from the B-17s and B-24s. And their numbers were beginning to come down as we knocked more of them down. And we were, I would estimate, we were probably getting 3 for every 1 they got of us. And that was because I think we had a better training, and maybe they were tired, and maybe they were getting too young. But it was definite that we had an advantage, especially over the 109s. Focke-Wulf 190s were a little tougher. They were about as fast as we were. but maybe at that point with the jug, we had better protection. They had a liquid-cooled engine, we had an air-cooled engine. And we could fly with part of a wing missing. That jug, God bless it, it would go through a house and keep you alive. It's amazing the things that we brought home and still got home. Then we were transferred from that into the escort of Patton tanks, which meant no longer going to 36,000 feet, except after we finished a ground level job and dropped our bombs or chased tanks, then we could go up and look for trains or German troops, whatever that we were looking for. We would go out actually 4 planes at a time and just search for targets and try to get rid of them. With Patton, it was mostly the tanks we had to try to keep away from his line of flight, or not flight, but intrusion. And that's the only reason I think that he was able to get to Paris at the short period of time that he did and take Paris. With Focke-Wulf 190 several times. I damaged one, I know, but I didn't get any knocked down that I had pictures of that I could prove. I had about 6 Ju-88s, but I caught them on the ground and that didn't count as far as a kill in the air. But we strafed an airport that was at St. Lo, which is only probably 20 minutes from where we were at St. Mary Lee's. And we caught them on the ground. 2 of them were trying to take off, and the wing group on the right got them before they get off the ground. We caught the rest of them on the ground. But I got 6 of them on fire before I finished 2 runs. Actually, emotions weren't that much involved. You know, it's amazing. I don't understand how it happens, but you become a fatalist. You know that you're going out, and well, General Quesada came and visited us when we were still at St. Mary Lee's, and had us in a group, and he was going to send us out on a new kind of mission. They were going to have us do dive bombing at night, 1 plane at a time. This was a wild dream is what we saw it. And I sat there for a minute, and I was probably a more vocal lieutenant than most. And finally I said, General, he asked if we had any questions. And I said, General Quesada, sir, if one flies every hour and somebody on radio is telling us what to do, when to dive, when to pull out, and drop our bomb and go home, how is it the Germans aren't going to know we're doing it every hour and be waiting there with night fighters, and we don't have night fighting equipment? And he said, are you afraid to fly, sir? I said, no, sir, I volunteered. And I sat down. And our CEO gave me credit for that. He told me afterward. And that mission never happened. But even in something like that, we had a fatalistic viewpoint. You're either going to make it or you're not going to make it. And we found out that the more experience we had, the longer we lived. It was a phenomenon, but the newest ones died quicker. They got caught unawares. They dove too low, didn't realize how fast they were going down, bombed themselves and killed themselves. Or were killed by the Germans. And, but it was a fatalistic thing that kept you alive, actually. I honestly can't tell you some of the areas that we moved, because when we broke up, we'd have maybe 8 airplanes, and we'd have to service them ourselves and pour the gasoline with tanks of gas up on the wing, and then take off again. And we'd be there for maybe 5 days. We'd move up to another place to be closer to Patton. That way we saved flying time and gasoline to be close. And I must have moved 5 times and by the time we got to Paris. And then we would back up north outside of Paris where General Eisenhower came, visited with Yvette. And at that time, I was asked to go down and fly near Swiss border for the 7th Army that was coming up from the south. And they had run into Germans in the mountains. And we did some dive bombing and strafing of German troops there at that point. I think I flew 4 missions from there and was received my orders to go back to England, to Liverpool, to teach some of the incoming pilots. And the theory was that we were going to be allowed to form a new group, and that would have meant my new rank if I was able to do that. We had 30 days to teach a new group, and on the 27th day we were called to an audience of 13 of us that were doing this with the commanding general, well, he was a colonel, I guess, and he told us that this program had been canceled and that we had the option of going back into combat with another outfit, not our old outfit. I don't know why that regulation, but we weren't going back to our old outfits, and or we could go home. And my father didn't teach me to have no brain, or a brainless stun, but being married, I chose to come home. Matter of fact, all 13 decided to go home, regardless of the number of missions we had at the time. So we came home on the Wakefield. Now we had a choice to fly home in 3 weeks or get on the Wakefield the next day and start home. Now the Wakefield was a Coast Guard ship. It was a remake of the Manhattan that had burned up in Singapore many years before, been rebuilt into a Coast Guard unit. And we got off of Greenland in a very big storm. I'd never seen waves so high coming right over the top of the deck. We lost a 3-inch gun off the front of the ship, believe it or not. And I was on OD that day. And I'm out there handcuffed to the railing underneath the captain's deck. And they sent 2 sailors out with handcuffs on the railing to get me off because they were afraid I'd get washed overboard. We hit something, and we came home with nose down on the Wakefield at 4 knots, went into Boston instead of New York where we were supposed to go at 3 in the morning. And I'll never forget the Salvation Army. There were no customs in Boston. There were no one to take the ropes for the ship to tie it down. We had to jump off and do it, along with some of the Coast Guard people. And suddenly we heard a ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, and here come 2 elderly ladies and an elderly gentleman. No one told us you were coming in. We're sorry. All we have is some warm coffee and old donuts. But they brought it down, and they were there. I don't know how they found out we were coming, but they were the only ones there. So when Salvation Army comes along, they get some of my donations. Yes, I did. There were 11 of us that came home of the original squadrons, 371st Fighter Squadron. One of the boys, Robbie, when we were in St. Dizier, used to visit a French girl. He was not allowed to sit in the living room without the parents. They were very strict. And I guess he went to see her 8 or 10 times. And when we came home, 2 years had passed by when he got to thinking about her again. And he wrote and asked her if she would marry him. And she got a letter back that she couldn't answer that. He had to write to her mother and father, Robbie Robinson. And he wrote, and they said, well, if you wish to marry our daughter, you have to be married within 3 days of her arrival in the United States, and then we will give her permission. So he agreed to that, and his mother and father had to be with him when she arrived. So the mother and father had a right to the mother and father of the girl, They got the correspondence back and forth. And to make a long story short, she arrived in New York, and I got a call at the house that Robbie was in the airport with the parents and with the daughter, and would I meet him somewhere? And I said, well, where are you headed? He said, well, we're going to Elkton, Maryland, where we can get married pretty quick. So I said, well, New Brunswick, I can meet you in New Brunswick. And I met them there, and he knew New Brunswick pretty well. He knew just about where to go, and it was a little bar. And he said, let's go in and have a drink. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. I said, Robbie, aren't you going to ask them to come in? He said, no, she can't speak any English. So she'll have to stay there with Mom and Dad. So I said, well, we went in and we had a beer together, and he told me all about it and how it came about, and that's why I'm able to tell it to you. And then they got in the car and they said goodbye, and he headed for Elkton, Elkton, because they had to be married before sundown. And I didn't hear from him for about 2 years, and we had a reunion at Lake Charles, and Barry Goldwater was supposed to be the speaker, and he was, but Robbie was there, and Colonel Klein was there. He had been our CO, and 4 others, Ike Eisinger and Sammy Green, and I think it was Bates. Bates was the other one that showed up. And we met at one of the houses there for a bit, and we had 22 inches of rain in Lake Charles, Louisiana that day and night. And my wife woke up and she said, honey, there's something wrong. There's water on the rug. And I looked down, and there was an inch of water on the rug. And the motel was being inundated. The water out on the car was up about 2 feet, was in the bottom of the car. And Barry Goldwater was supposed to be the speaker, as I mentioned. He went down to, he was in Phoenix, went to the base in Phoenix, was going to commandeer a plane because even as a retired general, he had rights. They said, sir, you're not going to fly that thing. You're going to have a pilot to take you to Alexandria, where he wanted to go, Alexandria, Louisiana. And he got there and he commandeered one of these big 8-foot wheeled trucks and came down, and he made the meeting. And I met him there, and he autographed his book for me. And we had our meeting there, and I think that was the last meeting that we were all together. But Ike and Robbie met us in Paris for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And we met with Yvette, and Yvette had received the President's Award from France for her bravery and for taking life on as she had under those conditions, and getting married and having a family and so forth. And she received many awards. One of them was probably the highest civilian award that the French ever gave. And we were, of course, given another award, which was meaningless, but it was nice that they had the courtesy to have us become parachutists. And we got the award of being parachutists, which we hadn't done, but it was great of them. Well, that was not a problem because we would be assigned specific targets, whether it be a Ford factory or a tractor factory or a plane factory or just a chemical factory, whatever it was, gasoline tanks. We knew pretty much what the first target was. After that, we were on our own to pick our own. Anything that looked like it was moving behind the American lines was a target.